Good evening, friends. Tonight we journey back through centuries to discover how our ancestors sought escape from harsh medieval realities through herbs, potions, and mysterious brews. We'll explore monastery gardens where monks cultivated powerful plants, witness peasants brewing strange concoctions in shadowy cottages, and uncover the sacred rituals that blurred the lines between medicine, mysticism, and mind alteration. Simple substances that could transport a weary soul from earthly suffering to otherworldly visions. If slow, story-rich history helps you unwind, feel free to tap like and subscribe, and in the comments, share where you're listening from and what the clock reads in your corner of the world. I'm always fascinated by how our sleepy community spans across time zones, united in this quiet hour. So, dim the lights. Let gentle sounds fill your space if you wish, settle into your most comfortable position, and allow the weight of modern concerns to fade as we step into the hazy, herb-scented chambers of the medieval world together. Imagine yourself in a small medieval village somewhere in the rolling countryside of 14th century Europe. The year matters little, for the rhythms of peasant life changed slowly across these centuries. Dawn breaks cold and gray through the cracks in your wattle-land daub cottage walls, and already you can hear the roosters announcing another day of toil. Your hands, rough from yesterday's labor in the fields, reach for the clay pot sitting near the dying embers of last night's fire. Inside, a mixture of herbs steeps in weak ale, a brew your grandmother taught your mother and your mother taught you. Among the familiar scents of chamomile and mint, there's something else, something darker, more potent, the distinctive, almost nauseating smell of henbane leaves. This is how many medieval mornings began, not with coffee or tea, but with herbal concoctions that walked a fine line between medicine and something far more mysterious. In a world where the average person rarely lived past 40, where a simple cut could mean death from infection, and where the Church's promises of paradise seemed impossibly distant from the mud and misery of daily existence, people found their escapes where they could. The medieval peasant's pharmacopoeia was surprisingly vast, though dangerously unpredictable. Every hedge, every meadow, every shaded grove held plants that could heal, harm, or transport the mind to realms beyond ordinary consciousness. These weren't exotic imports from distant lands, but common weeds and wildflowers that grew alongside the barley and rye. Consider henbane, that peculiar plant with its sticky leaves and funnel-shaped flowers of pale yellow veined with purple. Known by many names, devil's eye, Jupiter's bean, poison tobacco, it grew wild along roadsides and in waste places. Medieval texts describe it with a mixture of respect and fear. Hildegard von Bingen, the renowned 12th century abbess and herbalist, warned that henbane made people empty in their minds as if they were dead. Yet despite these warnings, or perhaps because of them, henbane remained a cornerstone of folk medicine. A small amount, properly prepared, could ease the terrible pain of toothache or help a laborer sleep despite aching joints. But the line between medicine and poison was gossamer thin. Too much, and the user would experience what medieval physicians called madness most horrible, hallucinations so vivid that reality itself seemed to dissolve. Picture a peasant woman, let's call her Marjorie, preparing for the harvest season. Her back already aches from years of bending in the fields, and she knows the coming weeks will bring pain that keeps her awake through the long nights. She turns to her small collection of dried herbs, stored carefully in the rafters away from mice and moisture. Among them, wrapped in rough cloth, are the seeds of henbane. She knows the proper dose, 3 seeds, no more, crushed and mixed with fat from a freshly killed pig. This salve, rubbed into aching joints, would numb the pain enough to allow sleep. But Marjorie also knows the stories whispered at the well and around the fire. Stories of women who used more than 3 seeds, women who claimed to fly through the night air, who spoke with spirits, who saw visions of the devil himself. The preparation of these psychoactive plants was an art passed down through generations, typically from woman to woman. In a world where formal medical knowledge was reserved for the wealthy and the clergy, peasant women became the keepers of herbal wisdom. They knew which plants to gather under the full moon, which required specific prayers or incantations during harvest, and most importantly, how to prepare them safely, or at least as safely as possible. Mandrake root held a special place in this medieval pharmacopoeia. Its humanoid shape, a thick taproot that often split into two leg-like appendages, gave rise to countless superstitions. Legend held that the mandrake screamed when pulled from the earth, and that this scream could kill anyone who heard it. Medieval herbalists recommended using a dog to pull the root, tying the animal to the plant, and then calling it from a safe distance. Whether anyone actually believed these tales, or whether they served as warnings about the plant's dangerous nature, we cannot know. What we do know is that mandrake, like henbane, contains powerful alkaloids scopolamine and atropine that can cause intense hallucinations, delirium, and in higher doses, death. The medieval understanding of these effects was filtered through the lens of religious belief and folklore. A person experiencing mandrake poisoning might report seeing demons, angels, or deceased relatives. Their pupils would dilate dramatically, giving them an otherworldly appearance. They might strip off their clothes, feeling an intense heat that had nothing to do with ambient temperature. To medieval observers, these symptoms looked remarkably like demonic possession. Yet mandrake, too, had its legitimate uses. Mixed with wine and administered before surgery, such as it was in medieval times, it could render a patient unconscious. Battlefield surgeons, dealing with arrow wounds and crushed limbs, valued mandrake preparations for their ability to spare patients the agony of amputation, though the line between therapeutic dose and fatal overdose remained perilously uncertain. Deadly nightshade, or belladonna, completed this trinity of powerful psychoactive plants commonly available to medieval Europeans. Its name, meaning beautiful woman in Italian, came from a cosmetic practice. Women would use drops of nightshade juice to dilate their pupils, considered attractive in certain periods. But this beauty came at a terrible price. In the small doses used cosmetically, belladonna caused mild disorientation and visual disturbances. Users might see halos around candle flames or experience a pleasant floating sensation. But peasants rarely used it for beauty. Instead, they turned to nightshade for its ability to suppress coughs, ease stomach cramps, and most intriguingly, to induce prophetic dreams. Consider the life of a medieval peasant more closely. Your days were governed by the sun and the seasons, your nights by darkness barely pushed back by expensive candles or smoky rushlights. Entertainment was limited to occasional feast days, traveling minstrels if you were lucky, and the stories told around the fire. In this world of limited stimulation and constant hardship, the allure of these mind-altering plants becomes more understandable. A young man, exhausted from a day of plowing with oxen, might chew a small piece of henbane root to experience what medieval texts called pleasant visions. For a brief time, the mud-floored cottage might transform into a palace, the coarse bread into a feast, the endless toil into distant memory. But there was always danger in seeking these escapes. The same plants that could provide temporary relief could also lead to tragedy. Medieval records, sparse as they are for common folk, occasionally mention deaths from evil herbs or instances of entire families poisoned by contaminated bread or ale. The intersection of these psychoactive plants with witchcraft allegations adds another layer to our understanding. The famous flying ointment, supposedly used by witches, contained a mixture of plants including henbane, nightshade, and mandrake, combined with animal fat to aid skin absorption. Modern researchers have confirmed that such a mixture, applied to sensitive skin areas, could indeed produce sensations of flying or floating. Imagine a wise woman, perhaps a midwife or healer, preparing such an ointment. She grinds the dried leaves in a mortar, the pestle worn smooth by generations of use. The acrid smell fills her small cottage as she mixes the powder with rendered fat. She knows the power of what she creates, the ability to separate mind from body, to journey while remaining still. These women, repositories of generational knowledge about plants and their properties, walked a dangerous line. Their neighbors might seek them out for remedies for everything from difficult childbirth to lovesickness, but the same knowledge that made them valuable also made them vulnerable. The ability to cure implied the ability to curse, and in times of hardship, failed harvests, mysterious illnesses, unexplained deaths, these women often became scapegoats. The medieval church's relationship with these psychoactive plants was complex and often contradictory. Monasteries maintained extensive herb gardens that included plants like henbane and mandrake, recognizing their medicinal value. Monks carefully copied and preserved ancient texts describing their preparation and use. Yet the same church condemned their use in folk practice, especially when associated with pre-Christian traditions or unauthorized healing. Picture a monastery garden in autumn. Neat rows of medicinal herbs grow behind stone walls, tended by brothers who see their cultivation as part of their duty to ease suffering. Among the sage and rosemary, the feverfew and comfrey, grow the more dangerous plants, carefully labeled, their locations known only to the herbalist brother and the abbot. The monastery's herbarium, the room where plants were dried and medicines prepared, would have been a fascinating blend of the sacred and the practical. Dried henbane flowers hang from the rafters alongside bundles of more innocent herbs. Manuscripts detailing their uses sit on shelves next to prayer books. The brother herbalist might spend his mornings in prayer and his afternoons grinding nightshade berries for a tincture to ease the prior's persistent cough. The preparation methods for these plants varied enormously depending on intended use and local tradition. Some communities preferred water-based decoctions, boiling the plants and drinking the resulting tea. Others favored alcohol tinctures, which better extracted the psychoactive alkaloids. Still others used the smoking method, burning dried leaves and inhaling the fumes. Each method produced different effects. A tea made from henbane seeds might produce mild sedation and pain relief. The same seeds, burned and inhaled, could cause powerful hallucinations and out-of-body experiences. Medieval practitioners learned these distinctions through dangerous trial and error, their knowledge paid for in suffering and sometimes death. Rural life in medieval Europe meant that most people had at least passing familiarity with these plants. Children learned early which berries would kill, which mushrooms to avoid, which flowers must never be brought inside the house. This knowledge was survival itself in a world without modern medicine, where a mistake in plant identification could mean death for an entire family. Yet alongside this practical knowledge ran deep veins of superstition and folklore. Henbane was said to attract spirits if grown near the house. Mandrake roots were carved into human figures and kept as talismans, fed with milk and wine, and passed down through families as precious heirlooms. Nightshade berries, despite their danger, were sometimes worn as amulets against the evil eye. The seasonal availability of these plants shaped their use. Spring brought fresh leaves, most potent for certain preparations. Summer saw the flowers bloom, each variety having its own particular properties according to medieval herbalists. Autumn provided berries and seeds, while winter forced reliance on dried stores, carefully preserved and rationed through the cold months. A peasant family's herb store was thus a pharmacy, a source of income through sales at market, and potentially a gateway to other realms. The same grandmother who used henbane to ease her grandchildren's coughs might also know how to prepare the stronger mixtures that brought visions, though such knowledge would be closely guarded, shared only with trusted family members if at all. The economic aspect of these plants cannot be ignored. While common enough to grow wild, properly prepared psychoactive plant products commanded good prices at medieval markets. A wise woman with knowledge of their preparation could supplement her family's meager income, though she risked accusation of witchcraft if her success aroused envy or suspicion. Medieval fairs and markets would have been fascinating places from this perspective. Among the legitimate merchants selling wool and grain, pottery and iron tools, moved others with more mysterious wares. An elderly woman might sell small cloth packets of dried herbs, whispering instructions for their use to buyers. A traveling merchant might offer exotic preparations, claiming his mandrake root came from the Holy Land itself, imbued with special powers. The recipes for these psychoactive preparations were often encoded in symbolism and metaphor, partly to preserve trade secrets and partly for protection against accusations of sorcery. A manuscript might speak of the herb of Saturn rather than henbane directly, or describe mixing ingredients under the sign of Venus rather than giving specific measurements. This coded knowledge appears throughout medieval texts, frustrating modern researchers trying to reconstruct exact preparations. When a medieval recipe calls for the fat of a child unbaptized, does it mean actual human fat, or is it a code for a particular plant oil? When it specifies gathering herbs at the hour of Mercury, what time exactly does that indicate? Some of these preparations combined multiple psychoactive plants, creating synergistic effects that medieval users attributed to supernatural causes. A mixture of henbane, nightshade, and poppy would produce effects quite different from any single plant. Users might experience paralysis combined with vivid hallucinations, unable to move while their mind traveled through fantastic landscapes. The role of these substances in medieval medicine extended beyond pain relief and sleep aids. They were used to treat what we might now recognize as mental illness, melancholy, mania, and various forms of what medieval physicians called lunacy. A person suffering from what we might diagnose as severe depression might be given small doses of nightshade to lift the spirits and banish dark humors. Treatment of the mentally ill in medieval times often involved these plants, sometimes therapeutically, sometimes as restraints. A violently disturbed patient might be given enough henbane to render them docile, easier for families to manage in an era without psychiatric hospitals. The line between treatment and control was often blurred. The gendered nature of this herbal knowledge deserves special attention. While university-trained physicians were exclusively male, the day-to-day health care of medieval communities fell largely to women. They delivered babies, treated childhood ailments, tended the sick, and prepared the dead for burial. This intimate knowledge of bodies and herbs gave them power in their communities, but also made them vulnerable to accusation when things went wrong. A midwife who used henbane to ease a difficult birth walked a narrow path. Too little, and the mother suffered needlessly. Too much, and both mother and child might die. Success brought gratitude and enhanced reputation. Failure could bring accusations of infanticide or witchcraft. The stakes could not have been higher. The intersection of these plants with medieval Christianity created fascinating contradictions. The same monks who preserved classical knowledge about psychoactive plants also preached against their recreational use. Yet mystical experiences induced by these substances might be interpreted as divine visions if they occurred in the right context. Consider a hermit, living alone in the wilderness, subsisting on wild plants and stream water. If his diet inadvertently included psychoactive plants, his resulting visions might be interpreted as divine revelations. Several medieval saints reported visions that modern toxicologists suggest could have resulted from ergot poisoning or consumption of psychoactive plants. The medieval world's relationship with bread adds another dimension to our story. Rye, a staple grain for peasants, was susceptible to ergot infection, a fungus that produces powerful psychoactive alkaloids. Entire villages might experience mass hallucinations from eating contaminated bread, events sometimes recorded as miracles or curses depending on the observer's perspective. Picture a village in late summer, the rye harvest completed and the grain stored in communal barns. If that grain harbored ergot, the entire community might spend the winter experiencing strange symptoms, burning sensations in the limbs, vivid hallucinations, and in severe cases, gangrene and death. Medieval chronicles describe holy fire or Saint Anthony's fire, what we now know as ergotism. The symptoms of ergot poisoning could be terrifying. Sufferers reported feeling as though insects crawled beneath their skin. They saw demons in the shadows, heard voices calling from empty rooms, felt their limbs burn with invisible fire. Some historians suggest that ergot outbreaks contributed to the social tensions that sparked witch trials. Yet even ergot had its uses. Medieval midwives knew that small amounts of ergot-infected grain could help stop bleeding after childbirth, though they wouldn't have understood why. They called it mother's rye and carefully controlled its use, knowledge passed from midwife to apprentice through generations. The preparation of these ergot-based remedies required extraordinary care. A midwife might keep a small store of infected grain, carefully separated from food stores, wrapped in leather and marked with symbols only she could read. The difference between a therapeutic dose and a fatal one could be measured in mere grains, knowledge gained through centuries of careful observation and, undoubtedly, tragic error. Beyond the commonly known psychoactive plants, medieval people had access to numerous other mind-altering substances. Poppy cultivation, though not as widespread as in the Mediterranean, existed in monastery gardens and some peasant plots. The milky sap, scored from unripe seed pods, would dry into a resinous brown substance, crude opium. Mixed with wine or ale, it provided relief from the constant pain that characterized medieval life. A farmer with a crushed hand from a millstone accident might receive poppy wine from the local wise woman. For a few precious hours, the throbbing agony would recede, replaced by a warm, floating sensation. Some described it as being wrapped in soft wool, insulated from the harsh edges of the world. But the relief was temporary, and the desire for more could become consuming. The social rituals around these substances reveal much about medieval community life. In some villages, certain feast days included communal consumption of mildly psychoactive brews. May Day celebrations might feature alesh infused with wormwood or sweetgale, plants that produced mild euphoria and increased sociability. These communal experiences, sanctioned by tradition if not by the church, provided rare moments of collective escape from daily hardship. Picture such a celebration. The entire village gathers in the square, tables groaning with the best food anyone can provide. A special ale, brewed by the village's most skilled alewife, flows freely. She's added herbs known only to her, perhaps a touch of yarrow for its mild psychoactive properties, some bog myrtle for its dreamy effects. As the afternoon wears on, the boundaries between neighbors soften, old grudges temporarily forgotten in the warm haze of communal intoxication. But not all use was communal or celebratory. In the isolation of winter, when darkness pressed in for 16 hours a day and food stores ran low, people turned to these plants for different reasons. A widow, alone in her cottage with only memories for company, might chew henbane seeds to bring visions of her departed husband. A shepherd, spending weeks alone with his flock in remote pastures, might smoke dried mushrooms to pass the long, lonely evenings. The medieval understanding of consciousness and altered states was fundamentally different from our modern perspective. They lived in a world where the boundary between natural and supernatural was permeable, where dreams could be prophetic, where visions might be divine communication or demonic deception. In this context, psychoactive plants were not just chemicals affecting brain chemistry, but doorways between worlds. A young person experiencing their first henbane-induced hallucination wouldn't think in terms of neurotransmitters and receptor sites. They would interpret their experience through the lens of their culture, seeing angels or demons, traveling to purgatory or fairy kingdoms, receiving messages from saints or temptations from devils. The subjective experience was shaped profoundly by expectation and belief. The role of these substances in folk magic and divination adds another layer to our understanding. Love potions often contain small amounts of nightshade or henbane, enough to cause mild disorientation and heightened suggestibility. A young woman desperate to win a particular man's affection might slip such a potion into his ale, though folklore is full of warnings about love spells gone wrong. Medieval texts describe various forms of divination involving psychoactive plants. One method involved burning henbane seeds and interpreting the patterns in the smoke. Another required sleeping with mandrake root beneath the pillow to receive prophetic dreams. Whether anyone truly believed these methods worked, or whether they simply provided a framework for accessing the subconscious insights that psychoactive substances can produce, we cannot know. The geographical variation in plant use across medieval Europe was considerable. In the northern regions, where the climate limited which plants could grow, people relied more heavily on mushrooms and lichens with psychoactive properties. In the Mediterranean areas, different traditions evolved around plants that thrived in warmer climates. Trade routes carried not just goods but knowledge, spreading information about new plants and preparation methods. A merchant traveling from Italy to England might carry more than silk and spices. Hidden in his packs might be seeds of new varieties of psychoactive plants, or manuscripts describing preparation methods unknown in Britain. This exchange of knowledge was slow and dangerous. The wrong information reaching the wrong ears could lead to accusations of poisoning or sorcery. The daily reality of living with these substances meant constant negotiation between benefit and risk. Every household had to make decisions about which plants to keep, how to store them safely, who could be trusted with knowledge of their use. Children had to be warned away from dangerous plants while simultaneously being taught their value. It was education that could mean the difference between life and death. Consider a mother teaching her daughter about the household herb garden. "This is feverfew," she might say, "for your father's headaches. And this is sage for winter coughs. But this," pointing to a small patch of henbane, "this you must never touch without my permission. It can cure or kill, and only experience teaches the difference." The economic disparities in medieval society affected access to and use of psychoactive substances. While peasants relied on wild-gathered plants and home preparations, the wealthy could afford exotic imports and professionally prepared medicines. A nobleman suffering from melancholy might receive theriac, a complex preparation containing opium and dozens of other ingredients, prepared by a university-trained physician. Yet sometimes the peasant's knowledge proved superior. Folk preparations, tested through generations of use, often proved more reliable than the complex compounds prescribed by learned physicians. A simple willow bark tea might provide better pain relief than an expensive imported preparation, though it lacked the prestige of exotic medicine. The seasonal cycles of planting, tending, harvesting, and preparing these plants created rhythms in medieval life. Spring brought the dangerous work of transplanting mandrake. Summer meant carefully tending the plants, protecting them from too much rain or sun. Autumn's harvest required precise timing. Too early and the alkaloid content would be low, too late and frost might destroy the crop. Winter was the time for preparation and trade. In the long, dark evenings, wise women would grind dried herbs, mix tinctures, and prepare the salves and potions their communities would need in the coming year. The work required patience, precision, and deep knowledge, qualities developed over a lifetime of practice. The transmission of this knowledge from generation to generation was primarily oral. While some written herbals existed, literacy was rare among the peasant class. Instead, information passed from mother to daughter, master to apprentice, through demonstration, repetition, and careful observation. Rhymes and songs helped preserve important information: which plants to avoid, which to harvest, when and how to prepare them. These mnemonic devices survive in corrupted form in children's rhymes and folk songs. Ring Around the Rosy may preserve memory of plague remedies, while other traditional songs encode information about seasonal plant gathering. The knowledge was hidden in plain sight, preserved in culture even when its original meaning was forgotten. The relationship between psychoactive plant use and medieval Christianity deserves deeper examination. While the Church officially condemned practices associated with paganism, including much traditional plant use, the reality was more complex. Parish priests living among their flocks often turned a blind eye to folk practices that seemed harmless, or participated themselves when illness struck their own households. A village priest, suffering from insomnia brought on by worry about his congregation's souls, might quietly accept a sleeping draught from the local wise woman. The same preparation he might condemn from the pulpit as witchcraft when used by others. These contradictions were part of the complex negotiation between official doctrine and lived reality. The medieval world's understanding of the relationship between body and soul meant that psychoactive substances occupied an ambiguous spiritual position. Were visions produced by these plants divine revelations, demonic deceptions, or merely physical symptoms of poisoning? The answer often depended on who was asking and who was experiencing. As we near the end of our journey through the daily experience of psychoactive plants in medieval life, consider how these substances shaped the texture of existence for ordinary people. They provided escape from pain, both physical and emotional. They offered glimpses of other realities in a world that could be numbingly routine. They connected communities through shared knowledge and experience. But they also brought danger. The same plants that could heal could kill. The knowledge that brought status could bring suspicion. The visions that might be divine could be condemned as demonic. Every use was a calculated risk, weighed against the harsh realities of medieval existence. Picture one final scene. An elderly wise woman, the repository of generations of herbal knowledge, sits by her fire on a winter evening. Around her, arranged in careful order, are the tools of her trade: mortar and pestle worn smooth by use, scales for precise measurement, jars of dried herbs, each labeled with symbols only she fully understands. She's preparing a special mixture, one taught to her by her grandmother and which she will soon teach to her granddaughter. The recipe exists nowhere in writing, too dangerous to commit to paper. It contains just enough henbane to ease pain, just enough poppy to bring sleep, just enough nightshade to quiet a cough. The proportions must be exact, the preparation method precise. As she works, she thinks of all the people she's helped over the years. The children whose fevers broke, the mothers who survived difficult births, the elderly whose final days were eased by her preparations. But she also remembers the failures, the times when, despite her best efforts, the balance tipped toward poison rather than medicine. This was the reality of psychoactive plant use in medieval times. It was never simple, never safe, never separate from the broader context of survival in a harsh and uncertain world. These plants were woven into the very fabric of medieval life, feared and sought, condemned and cherished, dangerous and essential. The knowledge of their use was one of humanity's oldest technologies, predating written history, refined through millennia of experimentation. In medieval Europe, this ancient wisdom met new pressures, from the church, from changing social structures, from the slow spread of literary culture and formal medicine. And so our first segment draws to a close. We've walked through medieval gardens where powerful plants grew alongside vegetables and herbs, witnessed the careful preparation of dangerous medicines, and glimpsed the complex negotiations between benefit and risk that characterized daily life with these substances. The peasant's escape through herbs and hallucinations was just one facet of medieval drug use. As we transition to our next segment, we'll explore how these humble plants became part of legend and literature, examining the tales of hashish-eating assassins and the exotic drug cultures that medieval travelers encountered in distant lands. But that is a story for the next chapter of our journey through time. As we leave the herb gardens and smoky cottages of medieval Europe behind, our journey carries us eastward, across the Mediterranean, through the ancient trade routes that connected west and east, into lands where the relationship between consciousness and divine revelation took different forms. Here, in the mountain fortresses of Persia and Syria, a legend was born that would captivate European imagination for centuries to come. The year is 1273. A Venetian merchant named Marco Polo, barely 20 years old, travels with his father and uncle along the Silk Road. Their journey will take them through territories that few Europeans have seen, past wonders that will strain credibility when later recounted. But of all the marvels Marco Polo will describe in his famous book, none will prove more enduring or controversial than his account of the old man of the mountain and his devoted followers. Picture the scene as young Marco first heard the tale. Perhaps in a caravanserai somewhere in Persia, the evening meal finished, merchants and travelers gathering around the fire to share stories. The smoke from oil lamps mingles with the sweet scent of apple tobacco from water pipes. Someone mentions the ruins of Alamut, the eagle's nest, destroyed by the Mongols just 20 years earlier. And then, in hushed tones, the stories begin. According to the tale Marco Polo would later record, there lived in these mountains a powerful leader known as the Old Man of the Mountain. His name was Hassan-I-Sabah, though by Polo's time the original Hassan had been dead for over a century, and the title had passed to his successors. This man commanded absolute loyalty from his followers through a remarkable deception. The old man, so the story went, had created a secret garden within his mountain fortress. This garden was designed to match perfectly the paradise described in the Quran, for rivers flowing with water, milk, wine, and honey, pavilions of silk and gold, and beautiful young women skilled in music and dance. But entrance to this paradise was not achieved through death in service to God. Instead, it was accessed through a powerful drug. Young men, carefully selected for their strength and courage, would be brought before the old man. They would be given a potion, hashish, according to Polo's account, that would render them unconscious. While insensible, they would be carried into the secret garden. When they awakened, they found themselves in what appeared to be paradise itself. Imagine awakening in such a place after a lifetime in the harsh mountain terrain. The air is warm and perfumed with jasmine and rose. Fountains play melodiously in marble courtyards. Every surface is decorated with intricate patterns that seem to shift and dance in the filtered sunlight. Beautiful attendants offer plates of exotic fruits, goblets of sweet wine, anything the heart might desire. For several days, these young men would live in this artificial paradise, their every wish granted, their senses overwhelmed with pleasure. Then, once again, they would be drugged and removed from the garden, awakening back in the ordinary world of the fortress. The old man would tell them they had been granted a glimpse of the paradise that awaited those who died in his service. The psychological impact of such an experience on a medieval mind cannot be overstated. These were people who lived in a world where the supernatural was ever present, where paradise and hell were not abstractions but real places waiting just beyond death. To have seemingly visited paradise and returned would be the most profound experience imaginable. According to Polo's account, these young men became the old man's devoted assassins, the Hashish-Eaters, from which we derive our word assassin. They would carry out any command, no matter how dangerous, believing that death in the old man's service would return them immediately to the paradise they had glimpsed. No fortress was too well guarded, no target too protected. They would strike in broad daylight, ensuring their own capture and death, secure in their belief of the reward awaiting them. But here we must pause and consider how much of this tale is truth and how much is legend embroidered by repetition. Marco Polo himself never claimed to have witnessed these events directly. He was recording stories told to him, already decades old by the time he heard them. Like a game of whispers across centuries, each telling might have added new details, new embellishments. The historical reality of the Nizari Ismailis, the actual sect led by Hassan-i-Sabah, was both more complex and more mundane than Polo's tale suggests. They were a Shia Muslim sect, devoted to a particular interpretation of Islam that emphasized the esoteric meaning of the Quran and the importance of a divinely guided imam. Their mountain fortresses were real, as was their use of targeted assassination as a political tool. The fortress of Alamat, where Hassan-i-Sabah established his power, was indeed formidable. Perched on a massive rock overlooking the valley below, accessible only by a narrow path that could be defended by a handful of men against an army. Here, Hassan created not just a military stronghold but a center of learning. The fortress contained one of the great libraries of the medieval world, with texts on philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and theology. Picture life within Alamat during its height. The morning call to prayer echoes across the valley. Scholars in the library carefully copy manuscripts, preserving knowledge from across the Islamic world. In the gardens, real gardens, not the mythical paradise of legend, herbs and vegetables grow to supplement the stores brought up the mountain by donkey train. It was a community devoted to learning and spiritual development, not the drug-fueled cult of European imagination. The question of hashish use among the Nizaris is particularly complex. The name Hashishin was indeed applied to them by their enemies, but most historians now believe it was a derogatory term, meant to discredit them rather than describe actual practices. The strict religious discipline of the Nizari Ismailis would have been incompatible with regular drug use. Their texts emphasize clarity of mind and spiritual purity, not the altered consciousness associated with hashish consumption. Yet the legend persisted and grew. By the time it reached European ears through travelers like Marco Polo, it had been transformed into something that fit European preconceptions about the mysterious East. The idea of drug-induced religious fanaticism was both thrilling and terrifying to medieval Christian audiences. It confirmed their beliefs about the dangers of Islam, while titillating them with tales of hidden pleasures and exotic practices. The actual relationship between hashish and medieval Islamic culture was far more nuanced than these legends suggest. Cannabis had been known in the Middle East for millennia, used for rope, cloth, and medicine. Its psychoactive properties were certainly known and utilized, but within specific contexts and with considerable controversy. In medieval Cairo, for instance, hashish use was common among certain segments of society. Sufis, Islamic mystics seeking direct experience of the divine, sometimes used hashish to facilitate their spiritual practices. They called it the revealer of secrets, and believed it could help strip away the veils between the human and the divine. But this use was controversial even within Sufi circles, with many prominent teachers condemning it as a dangerous shortcut that bypassed the discipline required for genuine spiritual advancement. Imagine a Sufi gathering in 13th century Damascus. The participants sit in a circle, having completed their prayers and ritual purifications. One among them produces a small ball of hashish resin, dark and fragrant. It's passed around the circle, each participant taking a small portion. As the drug takes effect, they begin their dhikr, the repetitive chanting of God's names. The combination of hashish, hyperventilation from the chanting, and spiritual focus produces a powerful altered state. Some participants report feeling their individual consciousness dissolve into unity with the divine. Others experience visions of prophets or angels. Still others simply feel a profound peace and understanding that transcends ordinary awareness. These experiences were carefully interpreted through Islamic theology and mystical tradition, not seen as mere drug effects but as glimpses of deeper reality. But alongside these spiritual uses existed more mundane consumption. In the medieval Islamic world, as in Europe, people sought escape from the hardships of daily life. Laborers might chew hashish to ease the burden of physical work. Soldiers might use it to calm pre-battle nerves. Writers and poets sometimes credited it with enhancing their creativity, though others warned it made men lazy and foolish. The great Islamic physician and polymath Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote extensively about hashish in his medical texts. He described its effects with clinical precision: the initial euphoria, the altered perception of time, the increased appetite, the eventual lethargy. He prescribed it for certain medical conditions, but warned against recreational use. His writings would influence both Islamic and European medicine for centuries. The social attitudes toward hashish in medieval Islamic society varied considerably by region and time period. In some places and times, it was tolerated or even celebrated. Poetry praising hashish's effects circulated in literary circles. Coffee houses might discreetly serve hashish preparations alongside their beverages. In other contexts, it was strictly prohibited, with religious authorities issuing fatwas against its use and rulers imposing harsh punishments. Consider the experience of a merchant in medieval Baghdad, navigating these complex social attitudes. He might know which coffee houses served hashish-laced sweets to their patrons, knowledge passed through whispered recommendations. He might participate occasionally himself, especially during festivals or celebrations, but he would also know the risks, not just legal punishment but social disgrace if discovered by the wrong people. The preparation methods for hashish in the medieval Islamic world were sophisticated and varied. The simplest involved rubbing cannabis flowers between the palms to collect the resin, which would then be rolled into balls or pressed into blocks. More elaborate preparations involved boiling the plants in butter or oil, creating potent extracts that could be mixed into foods or drinks. One popular preparation was majun, a confection combining hashish with honey, nuts, and spices. These sweets were sometimes sold openly in markets, their psychoactive contents an open secret. A small piece might produce mild euphoria and increased sociability. A larger portion could lead to profound intoxication lasting hours. The cultural productions inspired by or attributed to hashish use include some of the most celebrated works of Islamic literature. The tales of the 1001 Nights, with their dreamlike quality and fantastic elements, were sometimes said to be influenced by hashish visions. Whether true or not, the connection between altered consciousness and creative expression was widely recognized in medieval Islamic culture. But returning to our Venetian traveler and his famous account, Marco Polo's story of the assassins must be understood not just as a historical document, but as a cultural artifact. It tells us as much about European fears and fascinations as it does about actual practices in the medieval Islamic world. The idea of a drug that could produce absolute loyalty, that could make men willing to die without hesitation, spoke to deep anxieties about the nature of free will and religious devotion. The transmission of Polo's account through medieval Europe created its own mythology. As his book was copied and translated, details were added, altered, emphasized. Illustrators depicted the old man's garden with increasing elaboration. Paradise became more paradisiacal, the hashish more potent, the assassins more fearsome. Each retelling shaped the legend to fit the preoccupations of its audience. By the 14th century, the legend had become so embedded in European consciousness that it was treated as established fact. Writers would reference the assassins as a byword for drug-fueled fanaticism. Rulers worried about secret societies using similar methods in their own territories. The Templars, during their persecution, were accused of practices supposedly learned from the assassins. The reality of Nizari Ismaili practices regarding consciousness-altering substances was likely far more modest. While they may have had knowledge of various drugs and poisons useful for their political activities, there's little evidence for the elaborate paradise deception described by Polo. Their actual methods of ensuring loyalty were more conventional: religious education, communal bonds, and the promise of spiritual reward. Consider the actual training of a Nizari Fidai, one of their devoted agents. Rather than drug-induced visions, he would undergo years of education in theology, philosophy, and languages. He would memorize the Quran and study its esoteric interpretations. He would train in weapons and disguise, learning to blend into different social contexts. His loyalty came not from artificial paradise, but from genuine religious conviction and community bonds. The fortresses of the Nizaris were eventually destroyed by the Mongols in the 1250s, just a few decades before Marco Polo passed through the region. Alamut was razed, its great library burned, its community scattered. But the legends lived on, growing more elaborate with each telling. The old man of the mountain became a figure of European nightmare and fascination. His hashish-breathing followers the ultimate other, incomprehensible, dangerous, seductive. The broader context of drug use in the Mongol Empire that Marco Polo traveled through adds another dimension to our understanding. The Mongols themselves had their own traditions of consciousness alteration, primarily through fermented mare's milk called kumis. They were relatively tolerant of local practices in conquered territories, including the use of various psychoactive substances. Polo's own experiences traveling through these diverse cultures must have exposed him to many different approaches to consciousness and spirituality. In Buddhist monasteries, he might have witnessed meditation practices that produced altered states without any substances. In Hindu temples, he might have encountered the use of soma or bang in religious ceremonies. Each culture had its own understanding of the relationship between ordinary and non-ordinary consciousness. The economic dimensions of the hashish trade in the medieval period deserve consideration. Cannabis cultivation was widespread across Central Asia and the Middle East, but the production of high-quality hashish required specific knowledge and techniques. Trade routes carried not just the finished product, but also seeds, cultivation methods, and preparation techniques. A hashish merchant in medieval Persia operated in a complex legal and social environment. In some cities, he might operate openly, paying taxes on his trade. In others, he would need to work through intermediaries, his product hidden among legitimate goods. The profits could be substantial, but so were the risks, not just from authorities but from rivals and thieves drawn to valuable cargo. The medical uses of hashish in medieval Islamic medicine went far beyond its psychoactive properties. Physicians prescribed it for conditions ranging from epilepsy to earaches, from loss of appetite to melancholy. Medical texts carefully detailed preparation methods and dosages, attempting to maximize therapeutic benefits while minimizing unwanted effects. Picture a physician's consultation in medieval Cairo. An elderly patient complains of persistent pain and inability to sleep. The physician, trained in the traditions of Galen and Ibn Sina, considers various remedies. He might prescribe a preparation containing small amounts of hashish, combined with other herbs to moderate its effects. The goal was not intoxication but relief from suffering. The intersection of hashish use with Islamic law created ongoing theological debates. While alcohol was clearly prohibited by the Quran, hashish existed in a gray area. It wasn't mentioned in holy texts, leading to centuries of scholarly argument about its permissibility. Some argued it should be prohibited by analogy to alcohol. Others claimed it was fundamentally different and therefore permitted. These debates weren't merely academic. They had real consequences for users and traders. A shift in legal interpretation could mean the difference between open commerce and underground trade, between social acceptance and criminal punishment. Communities navigated these changing attitudes, adapting their practices to local conditions and current interpretations. The religious poetry of the period often reflected these tensions. Some poets celebrated hashish as a gift from God, a means of transcending earthly concerns and approaching divine truth. Others condemned it as a trap of Satan, leading believers away from the clear-minded devotion required by faith. These literary debates both reflected and shaped public attitudes toward the substance. One particularly revealing poem from 13th century Persia describes hashish as the comforter of the poor. Unlike wine, which required grapes, fermentation, and storage, making it expensive and associated with wealth, hashish could be produced cheaply and was accessible to common people. This democratic aspect of hashish use troubled some religious authorities who worried about its effects on social order. The preparation and consumption of hashish often involved elaborate rituals that went beyond mere drug use. In certain Sufi orders, the taking of hashish was surrounded by prayers, purifications, and specific practices designed to direct the experience towards spiritual ends. The drug was not the goal but a tool, like fasting or vigorous movement, for achieving particular states of consciousness. Imagine a gathering of the Haydari Sufis, an order known for their use of hashish in religious practice. The participants would fast for days before the ceremony, purifying body and mind. When they finally consumed the hashish, it would be in a sacred context, with specific intentions and under the guidance of experienced teachers. The resulting experiences were interpreted through elaborate symbolic frameworks, each vision or insight carefully examined for spiritual meaning. But Marco Polo, recording his tales for a European audience, had little understanding of these nuances. His account flattened complex religious and cultural practices into a simple narrative of drug-induced deception. The assassins of his telling were not complex historical actors but fairy tale villains, their hashish use not a disputed practice within Islamic culture but a defining characteristic of their otherworldly evil. The influence of Polo's account extended far beyond entertainment. European rulers and military commanders studied his descriptions, worried about encountering similar tactics. When the Crusader states in the Levant dealt with the historical Nazaris, they did so through the lens of Polo's legend rather than political reality. Negotiations and conflicts were shaped by European beliefs about Hashish-Madden fanatics rather than understanding of actual Ismaili beliefs and practices. The gradual transformation of the word assassin from a specific reference to the Nizari Ismailis to a general term for a hired killer reflects this cultural process. Each retelling of the legend stripped away more historical context, leaving only the image of the drug-crazed killer. By the Renaissance, European writers could use assassin without any reference to its Islamic origins, the word having taken on a life entirely separate from its historical roots. Yet even as the legend grew more fantastical, real cultural exchange was occurring. Venetian merchants like the Polos brought back more than stories. They carried actual goods, including various preparations of cannabis and opium. These substances entered European markets, their use shaped by the very legends that accompanied them. A Venetian nobleman might purchase hashish believing he was experiencing the same substance that created the assassins, adding a frisson of danger to his experimentation. The medical knowledge that traveled these same routes was more grounded in reality. Islamic medical texts, translated into Latin, brought sophisticated understanding of various drugs' effects. European physicians learned to prepare and prescribe substances like hashish and opium according to Islamic methods, though often without the cultural and religious contexts that had governed their use. Consider a European physician in the late 13th century, studying a recently translated text of Ibn Sina. He reads detailed descriptions of hashish's effects on the human body, how it affects appetite, mood, perception. He learns preparation methods and dosage guidelines. But missing from his understanding are the centuries of cultural negotiation around these substances, the religious debates, the social contexts that shaped their use in Islamic societies. The story of the assassins and their supposed hashish use also influenced Islamic culture itself. As the legend spread, some Muslims internalized European misconceptions about their own history. Later Islamic historians sometimes repeated Polo's account as fact, the legend having circled back to influence the very culture it supposedly described. This process of cultural reflection and distortion continued for centuries. Each culture's understanding of the other was shaped by these accumulated myths and misunderstandings. The hashish-eating assassins became a lens through which Europeans viewed Islamic culture, while Muslims encountered European fears and fascinations reflected back at them. The archaeological evidence from sites like Alamut tells a different story than the legends. Excavations have revealed sophisticated water systems, agricultural terraces, and architectural innovations. The library ruins suggest a community devoted to learning. But no secret gardens matching Polo's description have been found, no evidence of the elaborate deception he described. What has been found are small personal items, gaming pieces, children's toys, cooking implements that speak to ordinary life in these mountain fortresses. These were communities of families, not just warriors. Children played in the courtyards where legend places drug-induced training. Women managed households where European imagination saw only fanatical assassins. The economic impact of the Mongol destruction of the Nizari fortresses rippled across the region. Trade routes were disrupted, agricultural systems collapsed, libraries burned. The scattered Nizari communities preserved what knowledge they could, but much was lost, including, perhaps, genuine historical information about their actual practices regarding consciousness-altering substances. The diaspora of Nizari Ismailis after the fall of their fortresses created new patterns of cultural transmission. Communities established themselves from Syria to India, each adapting to local conditions while maintaining core beliefs. Their relationship with substances like hashish varied by location, in some places becoming more conservative in response to persecution, in others adapting to local practices. In India, where some Nizari communities settled, they encountered entirely different traditions of cannabis use. Here, bhang, a cannabis preparation, was integrated into Hindu religious festivals. The Nizaris had to navigate between their own traditions, local practices, and the legends that followed them. Some communities strictly prohibited all intoxicants, perhaps partly in response to the false accusations that had contributed to their persecution. The merchant networks that had connected the Nizari fortresses to the wider world found new configurations. Former residents of Alamut became traders in Damascus markets, scholars in Cairo libraries, farmers in Anatolian valleys. They carried with them knowledge of many things: architectural techniques, astronomical observations, mathematical innovations, and yes, possibly knowledge of various psychoactive substances and their preparations, but they also carried the burden of legend. To identify oneself as connected to the Nizaris might invite suspicion or persecution. Many chose to hide their origins, blending into local populations. Their knowledge, including any genuine traditions regarding consciousness-altering practices, was often lost or transformed in this process of cultural camouflage. As we near the end of our exploration of Marco Polo's legend and its historical context, we must consider what truth might lie beneath the embellishments. While the specific story of the old man's artificial paradise is almost certainly false, it's possible that the Nizaris, like many medieval communities, had some knowledge and use of psychoactive substances. Perhaps hashish was used medicinally in their fortresses, as it was throughout the Islamic world. Perhaps some individuals used it recreationally or spiritually despite official disapproval. Perhaps their enemies' accusations contained a grain of truth, exaggerated into the elaborate legend Polo recorded. We cannot know with certainty, and perhaps that uncertainty is itself instructive. The legend of the assassins reminds us how stories about drugs and consciousness can take on lives of their own, how fear and fascination can transform limited information into elaborate mythology, how cultural misunderstandings can become historical fact through repetition. These processes aren't confined to the medieval period. They continue today in how we understand and misunderstand different cultures' relationships with consciousness-altering substances. The real legacy of the Nizari Ismailis has little to do with hashish or assassination. They were preservers of knowledge during turbulent times, builders of remarkable architectural works, developers of sophisticated theological concepts. Their modern descendants, the Ismaili Muslims led by the Aga Khan, are known for philanthropy and education, not violence or drug use. Yet the legend persists, a medieval myth that refuses to die. The broader story of hashish in the medieval Islamic world reveals a complex negotiation between medicine and recreation, spirituality and law, individual experience and social order. Different communities at different times came to different conclusions about its proper role. These negotiations produced poetry and theology, medical texts and legal rulings, cultural practices that varied from celebration to prohibition. As European travelers like Marco Polo encountered these complex realities, they filtered them through their own preconceptions and purposes. The stories they told on returning home were shaped by what their audiences wanted to hear, tales of danger and exotic difference, not nuanced accounts of cultural complexity. The legend of the assassins gave European audiences exactly what they craved: a thrilling story of the mysterious East that confirmed their sense of cultural superiority while titillating them with forbidden possibilities. And so the hashish-eating assassins of Marco Polo's account stand as a monument not to historical truth, but to the power of legend. They remind us that the stories we tell about drugs and consciousness are never just about pharmacology. They're about culture, fear, power, and imagination. The old man of the mountain and his artificial paradise may never have existed, but the legend's influence on how East and West understood each other was all too real. As we prepare to leave the mountain fortresses of Persia and the merchant routes of the Silk Road, we carry with us questions about truth and legend, about how stories shape history and history shapes stories. Our next journey will take us across the ocean to the Americas, where entirely different traditions of consciousness alteration awaited European discovery. There, in rainforests and on mountain peaks, indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated relationships with powerful plants unknown to the Old World. Their practices would challenge European assumptions about consciousness, spirituality, and the boundaries of human experience. But that is a tale for our next segment, as we continue our exploration of humanity's long, complex, and continuing relationship with substances that alter the mind. As our journey carries us westward across the vast Atlantic, leaving behind the hashish smoke of Persian mountain fortresses and the merchant tales of the Silk Road, we enter a world where the relationship between plants and consciousness took forms that would challenge every assumption European explorers carried with them. Here, in the Americas, from the frozen north to the tropical south, indigenous peoples had developed relationships with psychoactive plants that went far beyond medicine or recreation. These were technologies of the sacred, doorways to dimensions of reality that Western thought had no framework to comprehend. The year is 1519. Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors marched toward Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire. Among the many wonders that await them, floating gardens, massive pyramids, markets larger than any in Europe, are practices that will disturb and fascinate them in equal measure. They will witness priests and nobles consuming substances that allow them to speak with gods, to journey to underworlds and heavens, to diagnose illness and predict future events. But long before these encounters, for thousands upon thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had been developing sophisticated traditions around sacred plants. Archaeological evidence suggests that peyote use in Mexico dates back at least 5,000 years. Cave paintings in Texas show human figures surrounded by what appear to be peyote buttons, their arms raised in ceremonial postures that modern Huacal shamans would recognize. Picture a night in the Chihuahuan Desert, perhaps 2,000 years ago. A small group gathers around a carefully tended fire. They have walked for days to reach this spot, following paths known to their ancestors, guided by stars and stories. The peyote cactus grows here, small and unassuming, barely visible among the desert stones. But to these pilgrims, each plant is a deity, a teacher, a doorway. The preparation begins before sunset. The pilgrims have fasted for days, drinking only water, preparing their bodies and spirits for the encounter to come. The peyote buttons, the above-ground portions of the cactus, are carefully harvested with prayers and offerings. Some will be eaten fresh, their bitter taste a trial that must be endured. Others will be dried for the return journey, to share with those who could not make the pilgrimage. As darkness falls and the first buttons are consumed, the ceremony proper begins. Songs that have been passed down for generations fill the desert air. These are not random melodies but precise sonic technologies designed to guide and shape the experience. Each song serves a purpose. One for the initial discomfort as the peyote takes effect, another for navigating the visions that follow, still others for specific healing work or divine communication. The effects begin slowly. First, a warmth spreading from the stomach, then subtle shifts in perception. Colors become more vivid even in the firelight. Patterns appear in the flames, in the sand, in the star-filled sky above. But these early effects are just the threshold. As more peyote is consumed through the night, consciousness undergoes a profound transformation. The pilgrims have always reported, across cultures and centuries, remarkably consistent experiences. They describe communicating with the spirits of ancestors, receiving teachings from power animals, witnessing the underlying patterns that connect all living things. They speak of dying and being reborn, of traveling to primordial times when the world was created, of understanding their place in the cosmic order. To the indigenous practitioners, these were not hallucinations in the Western sense, false perceptions caused by chemical disruption of normal brain function. These were revelations of normally hidden aspects of reality, as real and valid as ordinary waking consciousness. The peyote was not creating these visions, but revealing what was always there, hidden beneath the surface of everyday perception. The knowledge gained from these experiences was not abstract or merely personal. It had practical applications that sustained communities for millennia. Shamans would use peyote-induced visions to locate lost objects, to find game animals during times of scarcity, to diagnose illness and determine treatment. Weather patterns might be predicted, enemies' intentions discerned, community conflicts resolved through insights gained in the peyote trance. Moving south from the deserts where peyote grows, we encounter different sacred plants and different traditions. In the mountains and valleys of Mexico, various species of psilocybin mushrooms were revered as tiananacatl, flesh of the gods. The Aztecs, Maya, Mixtec, and Zapotec peoples each had their own relationships with these mushrooms, their own ceremonies and interpretations. Imagine a Mazatec healing ceremony in the mountains of Oaxaca, several centuries before European contact. The curandra, a woman known for her ability to navigate the mushroom realm, has been called to help a child who has been ill for weeks. As night falls, the family gathers in the one-room house. Candles are lit before images of saints, though these saints have features and attributes unknown to European Christianity, syncretic blends of ancient deities and newer religious forms. The mushrooms have been collected that morning, picked before dawn in secret locations known only to the curandra and her lineage. They are fresh, still carrying the energy of the earth from which they grew. She begins by eating several pairs. Mushrooms are always consumed in pairs, maintaining balance, and encourages the child's parents to do the same, though in smaller quantities. As the mushrooms take effect, the curandra begins to speak. But her words are not ordinary conversation. She speaks in couplets, in metaphor, in a poetic language that seems to come from outside herself. She describes what she sees in the child's body, not in medical terms but in images: dark clouds where there should be light, knots that need untying, spirits that have taken residence where they don't belong. The healing that follows involves songs, the smoke of copal incense, the laying on of hands. But more than physical intervention, it's a negotiation with the forces causing the illness. The curandra travels in her vision to speak with these forces, to understand their grievances, to broker peace between the human and more than human worlds. The child's recovery, when it comes, is understood not just as a biological process, but as a rebalancing of relationships. The Spanish conquistadors and missionaries who encountered these practices were horrified and fascinated in equal measure. They recognized the power of these substances to produce profound experiences, but interpreted them through their own theological lens. The mushrooms and other sacred plants were tools of the devil, they declared, false visions designed to lead souls astray from the true faith. Friar Bernardino de Sahagun, documenting Aztec culture in the 16th century, described mushroom ceremonies with a mixture of ethnographic interest and religious condemnation. He wrote of how participants would see visions of their future deaths, of how they would laugh and cry uncontrollably, of how some would see demons while others saw angels. His accounts, meant to document practices that needed to be eliminated, instead preserved invaluable information about pre-Columbian psychoactive plant use. The Spanish attempts to eradicate these practices drove them underground, but never eliminated them. Indigenous communities developed strategies of concealment and adaptation. Catholic saints were invoked alongside ancient deities. Mushroom ceremonies were held in secret, far from Spanish authorities. The knowledge was preserved, passed from teacher to student in whispered conversations and hidden rituals. Beyond peyote and mushrooms, the pharmacopoeia of the Americas included dozens of other psychoactive plants. Morning glory seeds, containing LSA compounds similar to LSD, were used by Aztec priests for divination. The seeds, called alaleuqui, were ground and mixed with water or pulque, producing visions that could last for hours. Priests would consume this preparation before making important prophecies or communicating with specific deities. In South America, the sophisticated plant medicine traditions of the Amazon basin developed entirely different approaches to consciousness alteration. Here, in the world's most biodiverse ecosystem, indigenous peoples identified and learned to use hundreds of psychoactive plants. But perhaps none was more significant than ayahuasca, a brew combining two plants in a synergy that modern science still struggles to fully understand. The discovery of ayahuasca represents one of the most remarkable achievements in human pharmacology. Somehow, indigenous peoples discovered that combining the ayahuasca vine, Banisteriopsis caapi, with leaves containing DMT, usually Psychotria viridis, created a powerful visionary brew. Neither plant is significantly psychoactive alone. DMT is destroyed by stomach enzymes, while the vine produces only mild effects. But together, the vine's MAO inhibitors allow the DMT to remain active, producing one of the most powerful psychedelic experiences known to humanity. Picture an ayahuasca ceremony deep in the Amazon rainforest. The participants have spent days preparing, following dietary restrictions, abstaining from sexual activity, focusing their intentions for the ceremony. The shaman, known as an ayahuasquero or curandero, has spent decades learning the intricate art of working with the medicine. His knowledge includes not just the preparation of the brew but hundreds of songs, called icaros, each designed for specific purposes within the ceremony. As darkness falls in the rainforest, a darkness more complete than most modern people ever experience, the participants gather in the ceremonial space, called a maloca. The ayahuasca has been brewing since dawn, the shaman carefully tending the fire, singing to the medicine as it cooks. The resulting brew is thick, brown, intensely bitter. Even experienced practitioners struggle to keep it down. The first cup is served with prayers and intentions. Within 20 to 40 minutes, the effects begin. Unlike the gradual onset of peyote or mushrooms, ayahuasca often arrives suddenly and overwhelmingly. Participants might experience intense nausea, what practitioners call getting well, purging not just physical toxins but emotional and spiritual blockages. Then the visions begin. Common experiences include seeing serpents, jaguars, and other power animals, geometric patterns of impossible complexity, encounters with plant spirits who appear as teachers or healers, visions of DNA helixes and molecular structures that indigenous peoples have been drawing for centuries before Western science discovered them. Many report experiencing their own death and rebirth, traveling to dimensions beyond ordinary space and time. The shaman guides the ceremony through his icaros, his songs. These are not entertainment but navigation tools, helping participants through difficult passages, calling in specific spirits for healing work, maintaining the ceremonial container that keeps the experience safe and productive. A master shaman might know hundreds of these songs, each received directly from the plants themselves during his own journeys. The medical applications of ayahuasca in indigenous contexts were extensive. It was used to diagnose illness, shamans reporting they could see inside the body, identifying problems invisible to ordinary sight. It was used for psychological healing, allowing people to confront traumas and fears in a supported context. It was used for community decision-making, with leaders drinking ayahuasca to receive guidance on important matters. But beyond individual healing, ayahuasca served crucial ecological and cultural functions. Indigenous peoples report that the plants taught them about the medicinal properties of other forest species, about sustainable hunting and agricultural practices, about the complex relationships that maintain rainforest ecosystems. This knowledge, accumulated over millennia of plant-mediated learning, allowed human communities to thrive in the Amazon without destroying it. The Spanish and Portuguese colonizers of South America had even less framework for understanding ayahuasca than the conquistadors in Mexico had for peyote and mushrooms. The complexity of the brews preparation, the intensity of its effects, and its central role in indigenous spirituality made it a prime target for missionary suppression. Yet, like other sacred plant traditions, it survived through secrecy and adaptation. Indigenous communities developed elaborate strategies to protect their knowledge. Certain preparations were hidden from outsiders entirely. Cover stories were created to explain ceremonial gatherings. The most sacred songs and preparation methods were shared only with carefully chosen apprentices. This protective secrecy means that even today, despite growing Western interest in ayahuasca, much indigenous knowledge remains hidden. The question of how indigenous peoples discovered these complex preparations remains one of the great mysteries of human history. Trial and error seems insufficient to explain how they identified active plants among the hundreds of thousands of species in their environments, or how they discovered complex preparation methods like the ayahuasca combination. When asked, indigenous peoples consistently give the same answer: the plants themselves taught us. This claim challenges Western materialist assumptions about consciousness and knowledge, yet the practical results are undeniable. Indigenous peoples developed sophisticated pharmacologies, sustainable agricultural systems, and complex cosmologies through their relationship with these plants. Whether one accepts their explanation or seeks materialist alternatives, the achievements remain remarkable. The ritual contexts surrounding these plant medicines varied enormously across cultures, but shared certain common elements. Preparation through diet and behavioral restrictions was nearly universal. The presence of experienced guides who could navigate non-ordinary states was considered essential. Music, whether drums, rattles, or songs, provided structure and navigation for the journey. Integration practices helped participants make sense of their experiences and apply insights to daily life. These were never recreational practices in the modern Western sense. Even in cultures where psychoactive plant use was relatively common, it was surrounded by ritual protocols and cultural meanings that shaped and contained the experience. A young person's first peyote ceremony or ayahuasca session was a rite of passage, marking their transition to full membership in the community. The plants were teachers, doctors, and bridges to the sacred, not entertainment or escape. The artistic traditions of pre-Columbian America clearly show the influence of these visionary plants. Pottery, textiles, and architecture feature the geometric patterns, transforming figures, and mythological beings that are characteristic of psychedelic experience. The serpents and jaguars of ayahuasca visions appear throughout Amazonian art. The deer, eagles, and geometric designs of peyote visions are woven into huical yarn paintings. These artistic representations weren't merely decorative. They were maps of consciousness, teaching tools that prepared initiates for the experiences they would encounter, and integration devices that helped make sense of ineffable visions. A textile depicting the transformation of human into jaguar wasn't fantasy but documentation of a lived experience accessible through plant medicines. The role of women in these plant medicine traditions deserves special attention. While popular imagination often depicts male shamans, women played crucial roles as curandras, midwives, and keepers of plant knowledge. In many cultures, certain plants were considered specifically female, requiring women practitioners to work with them. The Mexican tradition of mushroom healing was predominantly maintained by women, including the famous 20th century healer Maria Sabina. Consider a Shipibo woman in the Peruvian Amazon, inheriting the tradition of her grandmother. From childhood, she learns to recognize medicinal plants, to prepare remedies, to sing the healing songs called icaros. Her training involves years of plant dietas, periods of isolation where she consumes specific teacher plants, learning their songs and receiving their medicine. By the time she becomes a full curandra, she carries within her a living library of plant knowledge. The dietary practices surrounding sacred plant use were themselves profound technologies. The dieta wasn't simply about avoiding foods that might interact poorly with the plants. It was understood as a process of becoming receptive to plant intelligence. By simplifying one's diet, often to just plantains and rice or corn and beans, and avoiding salt, sugar, oils, and sexual activity, practitioners believed they became more sensitive to subtle plant communications. These restrictions might last days, weeks, or even months. During this time, the deiter would regularly consume small amounts of the teacher plant, not enough to produce strong visions but sufficient to establish a relationship. Dreams would become vivid and significant. Synchronicities would multiply. The boundary between human consciousness and plant consciousness would become increasingly permeable. The Spanish colonial period brought systematic attempts to eradicate these practices. The Inquisition investigated cases of peyote and mushroom use, treating them as witchcraft. Indigenous peoples found with sacred plants could face torture and execution. Ceremonial objects were destroyed, sacred sites desecrated, traditional knowledge holders persecuted. Yet the plants themselves became forms of resistance. In hidden ceremonies, far from colonial eyes, indigenous peoples maintained their connections to ancestral traditions. The plants helped preserve cultural identity, providing access to pre-colonial knowledge and cosmologies. They became symbols of indigenous sovereignty, links to a time before European domination. The syncretic religions that emerged during the colonial period often incorporated psychoactive plants in complex ways. In Mexico, the peyote hunt became associated with pilgrimages to Catholic shrines. Mushroom ceremonies incorporated prayers to the Virgin Mary alongside invocations of ancient deities. These adaptations allowed traditions to survive, while appearing to conform to colonial religious requirements. The medical knowledge preserved through plant medicine traditions proved invaluable even to colonizers. European physicians, struggling with tropical diseases unknown in their homeland, sometimes turned to indigenous healers for remedies. Quinine from the cinchona tree, learned from indigenous use, became crucial for treating malaria. Though Europeans rarely acknowledged the source of their pharmaceutical knowledge, The concept of plant consciousness, central to indigenous understanding, remained incomprehensible to European thought. Indigenous peoples spoke of plants as teachers, as beings with their own intelligence and agency. They described learning songs directly from the plants, receiving technological innovations through visions, understanding ecological relationships through plant-mediated experiences. Europeans dismissed these claims as primitive superstition, unable to recognize the sophisticated epistemology they represented. Consider the contrast between indigenous and European approaches to knowledge. European science sought to isolate active compounds, to understand mechanisms of action, to establish universal principles. Indigenous knowledge was relational, contextual, embedded in place and culture. A plant's effectiveness might depend not just on its chemistry, but on the songs sung during harvest, the intentions of the healer, the spiritual condition of the patient. The geographical distribution of sacred plants shaped cultural development across the Americas. The peyote religions of North America developed different characteristics from the ayahuasca traditions of the Amazon or the San Pedro cactus ceremonies of the Andes. Each ecosystem provided different teachers, different tools for exploring consciousness. Yet trade networks carried both plants and knowledge across vast distances, creating zones of exchange and synthesis. The Andes provided another crucial sacred plant, San Pedro cactus, containing mescaline like peyote but in different concentrations and combinations, had been used ceremonially for at least 3,000 years. Archaeological evidence from Chavan culture shows clear representation of the cactus in religious art. The tradition survived Inca expansion, Spanish colonization, and continues today. A San Pedro ceremony in the Peruvian highlands follows patterns both similar to and distinct from other plant medicine traditions. The cactus is usually prepared as a tea, boiled for hours until reduced to a manageable volume. The resulting brew is less bitter than ayahuasca, but still challenging to consume. The effects last 12 to 14 hours, a full journey from sunset to sunrise or beyond. The highland setting shapes the experience. Under vast Andean skies, with condors circling ancient peaks, participants report feelings of connection to the mountain spirits, or apis, central to Andean cosmology. The cactus is said to open the heart, producing feelings of empathy and connection. Healers use it to identify sorcery, to cleanse negative energies, to divine the future. The persistence of these traditions into the present speaks to their fundamental importance in indigenous cultures. Despite centuries of suppression, modernization, and globalization, plant medicine ceremonies continue throughout the Americas. In some cases, they've experienced revival and revitalization, as indigenous peoples reclaim cultural practices suppressed by colonization. The Native American Church, established in the late 19th century, represents one successful adaptation of traditional peyote use to modern circumstances. By incorporating Christian elements and establishing formal religious structures recognized by the United States government, indigenous peoples protected their right to use peyote ceremonially. This legal protection, won through decades of struggle, demonstrates how plant medicine traditions can evolve while maintaining core principles. The technical knowledge required to work safely with these powerful plants was vast and precise. Dosages had to be carefully calibrated based on the individual, the intention, and the specific batch of medicine. Certain medical conditions or psychological states were contraindications for use. The integration of difficult experiences required skilled support. This knowledge, accumulated over generations, represented a sophisticated harm reduction practice long before the term existed. Music remained central to almost all indigenous plant medicine traditions. Not background ambience but active technology for consciousness navigation. The rhythms of rattles and drums entranced listeners, facilitating the transition to non-ordinary states. Specific songs called in protective spirits, banished negative energies, or guided the journey in particular directions. A shaman's repertoire of songs was their primary toolkit, more important than any physical implements. The Icaros of the Amazon, the peyote songs of the Native American Church, the ceremonial chants of mushroom ceremonies, each represented a sophisticated technology for working with consciousness. These weren't random melodies but precise sonic formulas, their structures and frequencies specifically designed to interact with the psychedelic state. Learning these songs required years of training, often received directly from the plants in visionary states. The gender dynamics of plant medicine traditions varied considerably across cultures. While some traditions were exclusively male or female, others recognized multiple gender expressions and gave special roles to those who didn't fit binary categories. Two-spirit individuals in North American traditions often served as mediators between worlds, their liminal gender status giving them special facility with the liminal states produced by plant medicines. The botanical knowledge of indigenous peoples extended far beyond the famous psychoactive plants. They understood complex ecological relationships, knowing which plants grew together, which insects or animals indicated the presence of medicinal species, how climate patterns affected potency. This knowledge allowed them to find medicines even when traveling to unfamiliar territories, reading the landscape like a vast pharmaceutical text. The concept of reciprocity was central to indigenous plant medicine traditions. Plants weren't simply resources to be exploited but partners in relationship. Offerings were made before harvest. Prayers of gratitude followed ceremonies. Conservation practices ensured sustainable harvesting. Some plants could only be gathered by certain people at certain times, preventing overexploitation. The violence of colonization disrupted these reciprocal relationships. Sacred groves were cleared for agriculture. Ceremonial sites were destroyed or built over with churches. Traditional knowledge holders were killed or forced to abandon their practices. The plants themselves sometimes became extinct in regions where they had been tended for millennia. Yet the plants also provided resilience. In visions and dreams, ancestral knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Young people who had never learned traditional songs would receive them directly from the plants. Lost preparation methods were rediscovered through plant-guided experimentation. The medicines themselves became vehicles for cultural revival and decolonization. The morning glory seeds used by the Aztecs provide an interesting case study in the survival of tradition. After the Spanish conquest, the use of alaleuque was driven so far underground that by the 20th century, many scholars believed the practice had been completely eradicated. Yet, ethnobotanist Richard Schultz discovered in the 1940s that Zapotec peoples had maintained the tradition in secret for over 400 years. The preparation methods had been preserved with remarkable fidelity. The seeds were still ground on the same type of stone metates used in pre-Columbian times. The dosages remained consistent with those described in colonial-era documents. The ceremonial contexts, while influenced by centuries of Catholicism, maintained core indigenous elements. This discovery demonstrated the remarkable resilience of traditional knowledge even under severe suppression. As dawn approaches in our narrative journey through the sacred plant traditions of the Americas, we must acknowledge what has been lost. Languages that encoded subtle distinctions in plant knowledge have disappeared. Lineages of knowledge holders have been broken. Ecosystems that nurtured both plants and traditions have been destroyed. but we must also recognize what survives and even thrives. Indigenous peoples across the Americas continue to maintain relationships with sacred plants, adapting ancient traditions to modern contexts. The plants themselves, patient teachers that they are, continue to offer their medicine to those who approach with respect and proper preparation. The sacred plants of the Americas challenged and continue to challenge Western assumptions about consciousness, intelligence, and the nature of reality itself. They suggest that awareness might not be limited to human minds, that knowledge can be transmitted through nonverbal means, that the boundaries between self and world are more fluid than materialist science assumes. As our exploration of indigenous American plant medicine traditions draws to a close, we prepare to return across the Atlantic for our final segment. There we'll examine how Europeans, particularly the educated and artistic elite, encountered and embraced their own relationships with consciousness-altering substances, from the laudanum-soaked literary salons of London to the opium dens of Paris. But those stories of Victorian excess and romantic experimentation seem almost quaint compared to the profound spiritual technologies we've encountered in the Americas. Here, in ceremonies refined over millennia, human consciousness learned to dance with plant intelligence, creating forms of knowledge and healing that Western science is only beginning to appreciate. As we return from the ceremonial fires and sacred gardens of the Americas, crossing back over the Atlantic's dark waters, we find ourselves in a very different world of consciousness alteration. Here, in the gaslit parlors of London, the salons of Paris, and the studies of countless European intellectuals, another relationship with psychoactive substances was unfolding, not through ancient ceremony or spiritual tradition, but through small brown bottles purchased from any chemist's shop, containing a tincture that would define an era. Laudanum, the very word carries a weight of Victorian melancholy, of brilliant minds wrestling with pain and seeking inspiration in opium's embrace. This simple preparation, opium dissolved in alcohol, often flavored with spices or wine, became as common in 19th century households as aspirin is today. Yet its story is far more complex than simple medicine or mere recreation. It's a tale of genius and addiction, of medical ignorance and literary brilliance, of social privilege and working-class suffering. Picture a gentleman's study in London, 1821. Thomas de Quincey sits at his mahogany desk, quill in hand, struggling to capture in words an experience that defies description. Before him lies the manuscript that will become Confessions of an English Opium-Eater, the first major literary work to detail the subjective experience of opium use and addiction. His laudanum bottle sits within easy reach, its dark contents both muse and torment. De Quincey had first encountered laudanum as a young man suffering from facial neuralgia, a condition causing excruciating nerve pain. A friend suggested he try laudanum, available without prescription from any druggist. That first dose, he would later write, was revelation. Here was a panacea, a phi-rho mu alpha kappa omicron nu eta papsilon nu theta, for all human woes. Here was the secret of happiness, about which philosophers had disputed for so many ages. The relief wasn't merely physical. De Quincey described how laudanum transformed his mental state, elevating his thoughts to heights of philosophical abstraction he had never before achieved. Under its influence, he felt he could perceive the hidden connections between all things, could hold vast systems of thought in his mind simultaneously. Music became almost unbearably beautiful. Architecture revealed its mathematical harmonies, and ordinary faces in the street seemed to glow with inner significance. But De Quincey's account was revolutionary not just for its rhapsodic descriptions of opium's pleasures. He also detailed with unflinching honesty the horrors that followed, the tolerance that required ever-increasing doses, The nightmares that replaced pleasant dreams, visions of vast, crocodile-haunted waters, of infinite architectural labyrinths, of time dilated into centuries of suffering. The physical dependency that made stopping impossible without unbearable pain. His daily consumption eventually reached extraordinary levels, up to 8,000 drops of laudanum per day, when a typical medical dose might be 25 drops. He described lying paralyzed for hours, unable to move or speak, trapped in mental landscapes of indescribable complexity and horror. Yet even as he suffered, he continued to find in opium a key to experiences and insights unavailable to the sober mind. De Quincey wasn't alone in his relationship with laudanum. His contemporary and friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge had an equally complex and ultimately tragic involvement with the drug. Coleridge had begun using laudanum for relief from rheumatic pain, but like De Quincey, he discovered its effects went far beyond mere analgesia. Consider Coleridge in 1797, staying at a farmhouse in Somerset, recovering from an illness. He takes a prescribed dose of laudanum and falls into a deep sleep while reading about Kubla Khan in Purchas's Pilgrimage. In this opium dream, an entire poem appears to him, complete and perfect, not composed but received, as if dictated by some external intelligence. He wakes and begins frantically writing, capturing the famous opening lines that every English student would later memorize. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan / a stately pleasure dome decree / where Alf, the sacred river, ran / through caverns measureless to man / down to a sunless sea. But then comes the famous interruption. A person from Porlock arrives on business, and by the time Coleridge returns to his desk, the vision has faded. The poem remains forever a fragment, a glimpse of what Coleridge believed was a complete work existing in some opium-accessible dimension, now lost to ordinary consciousness. This idea of opium as a key to hidden realms of creativity became central to Romantic thought. Artists and writers didn't see themselves as merely getting high for pleasure, but as explorers of consciousness, using laudanum as European explorers used ships to reach undiscovered territories of the mind. The drug became associated with genius itself, a tool for accessing the sublime. The medical establishment of the early 19th century had little understanding of addiction or tolerance. Physicians prescribed laudanum liberally for conditions ranging from coughs and diarrhea to female troubles and nervous exhaustion. The Lancet and other medical journals published articles praising opium as one of God's greatest gifts to suffering humanity. It was considered safer than bloodletting, more reliable than mercury treatments, more humane than the restraints used for mental distress. A typical middle-class household medicine cabinet would contain multiple opium preparations: Godfrey's cordial for quieting babies, Dover's powder for fever and pain, Batley's sedative solution for nervous conditions, and of course simple laudanum for general use. These weren't hidden or shameful. They were displayed alongside other remedies, their use as normal as taking tea. The preparation of laudanum itself varied considerably. The standard British pharmacopoeia recipe called for powdered opium to be macerated in proof spirit for 7 days, then strained and diluted. But every chemist had their own variation. Some added saffron for color, cinnamon and cloves for taste, or wine for a smoother effect. The concentration could vary wildly. What one chemist called laudanum might be twice as strong as another's preparation. Women's relationship with laudanum deserves particular attention. In an era when women were denied most forms of agency and expression, laudanum offered both escape and, paradoxically, a form of control. The nervous exhaustion, so commonly diagnosed in Victorian women, often a result of the crushing limitations placed on their lives, was routinely treated with laudanum. Picture a lady of leisure in her drawing room, 1850. She's completed her morning calls, supervised the servants, written her correspondence in perfect copperplate script. The afternoon stretches before her, empty of meaningful activity. She reaches for her laudanum bottle, taking just enough to soften the edges of her circumscribed existence. Under its influence, the wallpaper patterns become fascinating, the ticking of the clock slows to a comfortable rhythm, and the suffocating expectations of her position temporarily recede. But for working-class women, laudanum served different purposes. A factory worker, exhausted from 14-hour days at the loom, might use laudanum to quiet her crying infant so she could snatch a few hours of sleep. A washerwoman with chronic back pain from years of bending over tubs would rely on laudanum to keep working. For them, it wasn't about accessing sublime experiences but surviving brutal daily reality. The phenomenon of infant doping reveals the darkest aspects of laudanum's widespread availability. Working mothers, forced to leave babies with minders while they labored in factories, would ensure their children remained quiet by dosing them with Godfrey's cordial or Street's infant quietness. These preparations contained enough opium to sedate an infant for hours. Many never woke up. Infant mortality rates in industrial areas were staggering, with opium overdose a significant but often unreported cause. Yet even as these tragedies unfolded in working-class neighborhoods, the literary elite continued their romance with opium. Elizabeth Barrett Browning relied on laudanum for decades, initially prescribed for various ailments but eventually becoming completely dependent. Her letters describe both the relief it provided and her struggles to reduce her consumption. "I am in a horrible state of weakness and nervousness," she wrote to a friend in 1843, "and forced to increase my opium a good deal. I don't sleep without it, and the pulse flutters and stops if I don't take enough." Yet she continued to produce brilliant poetry, leading some to wonder whether the laudanum enhanced or merely enabled her creativity. The French had their own relationship with opium, one that took on different cultural colorings. Baudelaire, inspired by De Quincey's Confessions, which he translated into French, experimented extensively with both opium and hashish. His Les Paradis Artificiels explored the psychological effects of both substances with a poet's sensibility and a philosopher's rigor. Baudelaire distinguished between the effects of hashish and opium with remarkable precision. Hashish, he wrote, exaggerated the user's existing personality and circumstances, a mirror that magnified. Opium, by contrast, imposed its own reality, transporting the user to realms independent of their ordinary life. He warned that both were false paradises, ultimately leading to spiritual and physical degradation, even as he continued to use them. The Parisian opium dens that emerged in the mid-19th century created spaces where social boundaries temporarily dissolved. In these dimly lit rooms, thick with sweet smoke, aristocrats reclined next to artists, bourgeois merchants next to courtesans. The shared experience of opium intoxication created a temporary equality, though one that evaporated as soon as participants returned to the street. Imagine entering such an establishment near the Rue Saint-André-des-Arts, circa 1860. The proprietor, perhaps a former sailor who learned the practice in Asian ports, guides you to a low couch. The room is decorated in Oriental style, silk cushions, brass lamps, paintings of exotic landscapes that may or may not resemble any real place in Asia. The opium pipe is prepared with ceremonial precision, the dark resin carefully heated over a spirit lamp until it bubbles and releases its distinctive smoke. The social ritual of opium smoking was entirely different from the solitary consumption of laudanum. It required technique, patience, and often assistance. The smoker would lie on their side, head supported by a hard pillow, while an attendant prepared each pipe. The smoke had to be drawn in completely and held, then slowly exhaled. Novices often felt nothing from their first attempts, the technique being as important as the substance. Medical understanding of opium was advancing, albeit slowly. By the 1850s, morphine had been isolated from opium and was being administered by the newly invented hypodermic needle. This was initially hailed as a great advance, pure, predictable, and supposedly less addictive than crude opium. Doctors would soon learn how wrong they were, but for a brief period, morphine injection was seen as the scientific solution to pain management. The American Civil War created an enormous population of morphine addicts, soldiers treated for battlefield injuries who returned home dependent on the drug. Soldiers' disease, as morphine addiction was euphemistically called, affected hundreds of thousands of veterans. Many turned to laudanum when morphine became harder to obtain, creating a new market for patent medicines containing opium. The patent medicine industry of the late 19th century represents perhaps the most cynical chapter in opium's Western history. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed to mothers for teething babies, contained morphine and alcohol. Ayer's cherry pectoral promised to cure consumption while delivering a steady dose of opiates. These preparations were advertised in respectable publications, their true contents rarely disclosed. Literary production continued to be associated with opium use throughout the Victorian era. Wilkie Collins wrote The Moonstone, one of the first detective novels, while consuming enormous quantities of laudanum for his gout. The plot itself involves opium. The theft of the titular diamond is committed under the influence of laudanum, the mystery solved through recreating the drugged state. Collins's description of opium's effects in the novel shows intimate familiarity. The sublime intoxication of opium had got into my brain. The miseries and perplexities of the daylight life seemed like a troubled dream. I had attained to that delicious state of repose which is the perfection of the opium-eater's enjoyment. But by the 1870s, medical opinion was beginning to turn against unrestricted opium use. The concept of addiction as a disease rather than moral failing was slowly emerging. The Society for the Study of Inebriety, founded in 1884, began documenting cases of opium dependence with scientific rigor. They noted the progression from therapeutic use to dependency, the escalating doses, the impossibility of cessation without medical support. Treatment methods were primitive and often cruel. Sudden cessation involved simply cutting off the opium supply and restraining the patient through withdrawal, a process that could be fatal. Gradual reduction was more humane but required enormous willpower from the patient and skill from the physician. Many patients cycled through multiple attempts at cure, returning to laudanum after each failure. The class dimensions of opium use became increasingly apparent as the century progressed. Wealthy users could afford discreet medical treatment, retreats to specialized clinics, and pure preparations from reputable chemists. Poor users faced contaminated products, judgmental charity hospitals, and criminal prosecution as laws gradually tightened. The same substance. And so, dear listener, our journey through the centuries draws to a gentle close. We've wandered through medieval gardens where wise women gathered henbane under the moon's pale light, traversed the mountain fortresses of Persia where legends of hashish and paradise were born, journeyed deep into American rainforests where indigenous peoples learned the songs of sacred plants, and finally returned to the gaslit studies of Victorian England, where laudanum promised both inspiration and oblivion. Through all these times and places, we've witnessed humanity's endless negotiation with consciousness itself. The peasant woman applying flying ointment in her cottage, the Mazatec healer singing over psilocybin mushrooms, the English poet searching for truth in opium dreams, all were participants in the same timeless human story, the search for something beyond ordinary experience, for relief from suffering, for knowledge hidden from everyday awareness. What strikes us now in the quiet of this modern night is how much has changed and how much remains the same. The substances that once sat openly on pharmacy shelves are now locked away behind prescriptions and regulations. The plant teachers that indigenous peoples consulted for millennia have been reduced to chemical formulas and pharmaceutical patents. The mystical experiences that medieval people interpreted as divine visions or demonic deceptions are now explained through neurotransmitters and receptor sites. Yet the fundamental human experiences remain unchanged. Pain still demands relief. Consciousness still yearns to explore its own boundaries. The weight of existence still sometimes requires temporary escape. We've simply changed the frameworks through which we understand these experiences, trading spiritual cosmologies for scientific materialism, ritual containers for clinical settings. As you lie here in the safety and comfort of your modern bed, far removed from the harsh realities of medieval life, free from the diseases that plagued our ancestors, surrounded by conveniences they couldn't imagine, take a moment to appreciate this remarkable privilege. You don't need to seek escape through dangerous potions or risk poisoning from uncertain preparations. Your pain can be managed with tested medicines, your sleep aided by understanding of circadian rhythms and sleep hygiene. The medieval peasant who chewed henbane seeds to escape chronic pain would marvel at your acetaminophen. The Victorian lady reaching for her laudanum bottle would be astonished by modern antidepressants. The indigenous shaman traveling through ayahuasca realms might be intrigued by the brain imaging that shows neural networks lighting up during psychedelic experiences, but perhaps they would also recognize something essential that we've lost. The medieval wise woman understood plants as allies and teachers, not just chemical factories. The indigenous peoples knew consciousness as a vast territory to be explored with proper guidance, not a problem to be solved. Even the Victorian Opium-Eaters, for all their suffering, experienced dimensions of mind that our safety-focused culture rarely acknowledges. Tonight, as sleep approaches naturally, without potions or preparations, you carry within you the inherited wisdom of all these ancestors. Your brain contains the same receptors that responded to their sacred plants and powerful medicines. Your dreams tonight will explore the same mysterious territories they accessed through their substances. The difference is that you can journey there safely, naturally, without risk. The gentle pull of sleep you're feeling now, that soft heaviness in your limbs, the way thoughts are beginning to drift and merge, this is your birthright, encoded in millions of years of evolution. No external substance needed, just the remarkable chemistry of your own brain, producing its own gentle opiates, its own soothing cannabinoids, its own perfect cocktail for rest and restoration. As you drift deeper towards sleep, let the stories we've shared tonight fade into the background, becoming like distant music, present but no longer demanding attention. The medieval villages, the Persian mountains, the Amazon rainforest, the Victorian parlors, all dissolving now into the universal human story of consciousness exploring itself. Rest now in the knowledge that you're safe, that the long human experiment with consciousness alteration has led us here, to this moment of understanding and relative wisdom. The plants still grow in their hidden places, the chemists still search for new molecules, the human mind still wonders what lies beyond its ordinary boundaries, but tonight you need only the ancient, natural pathway to altered consciousness that awaits you in sleep. Let go now. There's nothing more to do, nothing more to understand. The stories have been told, the journey completed. You're here, in this moment, in perfect safety. And sleep, that most gentle and necessary of all consciousness alterations, is ready to carry you into its realm of dreams and restoration. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with only the most gentle visions, far from the dangerous experiments of our ancestors, safe in the harbor of modern understanding, drifting now into peaceful, restful sleep.